Welcome to Pod Save America. I'm Jon Favreau.
I'm Tommy Vietor.
And joining us today, while Lovett is on vacation, New York Times journalist Jane Coaston. Jane, so excited to have you on the pod.
Amazing. I'm thrilled. I mean, being on vacation also sounds cool, but I would rather be with you guys.
Thank you.
Well, and you've joined on a sunny day for news. On today's show, the Taliban take Afghanistan as the Biden administration scrambles to contain the fallout, and the latest culture war is the right-wing crusade against vaccine and mask requirements. All right, let's get to the news. The Taliban has taken over Afghanistan nearly 2 decades after the American military drove them from power. The U.S. government had anticipated the eventual collapse of the Afghan government after President Biden announced he would make good on President Trump's deal with the Taliban to remove all U.S. forces from Afghanistan this year. But the Biden administration was surprised by the speed and success of the Taliban's final military offensive, which ended with the capture of Kabul and chaotic scenes at the international airport, where Americans, Afghans, and other allies have been desperately trying to leave. Over the weekend, the president announced that an additional 6,000 U.S. troops would be deployed to Afghanistan to help people evacuate safely, and there's reporting that the Pentagon could relocate up to 30,000 Afghans who've applied for special immigrant visas to military bases in the U.S. In his Saturday statement, Biden also said, quote, "1 more year or 5 more years of U.S. military presence would not have made a difference if the Afghan military cannot or will not hold its own country, and an endless presence in the middle of another country's civil conflict was not acceptable to me." Tommy, can you talk about the circumstances that led Trump and then Biden to decide on that full withdrawal as the only remaining option, and how the situation devolved from those announcements to the scenes of chaos that we've been seeing at the airport?
Sure. I'll try to do a quick version. I mean, I think they both had the same calculus, which was that the U.S. went to Afghanistan to get the people responsible for 9/11, like bin Laden, and then degrade al-Qaeda to the point where the al-Qaeda members in Afghanistan and Pakistan couldn't plan another 9/11 and strike the U.S. again. That part was pretty successful. But the exit strategy that the U.S. created to get out of Afghanistan was to build the capacity of the Afghan government and the Afghan military so that we could hand over control of security to the government-led forces and then facilitate a peace deal between the Afghan government and the Taliban. Trump negotiated a deal with the Taliban that would have had U.S. forces out of Afghanistan on May 1st, 2021 in exchange for some assurances that are probably not worth the paper they're written on. Biden extended that deadline to August 31st. So fast forward to today, how things just, unraveled so quickly. When the U.S. pulled out without U.S. air support and logistical support, it sounds like the Afghan government just literally couldn't get food and supplies to their forces, especially the ones in more remote locations. And I think they made a mistake not pulling back from some of the more remote locations to protect just population centers. And then even further back, maybe sometime last year, local Afghan officials started cutting basically mini peace deals with the Taliban, mini ceasefires. And when the deadline for the U.S. to get out got closer, more and more of these deals started getting cut. And so what happened was districts, capitals just handed over control to the Taliban. It wasn't that the Afghan forces were defeated. It's that most of them just didn't fire a shot. That's not true for the special forces, the elite commando units. They were fighting really hard in places like Kandahar, but there just aren't enough of those forces as compared to the broader Afghan army and broader Afghan police. So that's how, the Taliban just marched into Kabul. I mean, I think the regular forces decided we're not getting paid in some cases. We don't believe in this government. This is not worth dying for. And so they basically said, here's the U.S. supplied M4 rifle I was given. It's yours now. I'm gonna go home.
Jane, why do you think that these two very different presidents, Trump and Biden, ultimately overruled their military officials who recommended reportedly keeping 2,500 troops in Afghanistan while trying to reach a peace agreement with the Taliban?
I think that it speaks to one of the there's been a lot of talk online today about the Blob, and people are referencing the Blob, are talking about kind of the foreign policy apparatus that has largely been supportive of first this war and then continuing involvement in Afghanistan, and I would also argue Iraq. Mm-hmm. And so I think that one thing, and it's been interesting to see that apparently Donald Trump has scrubbed all reference to his own deal or attempted deal with the Taliban from his website. Yeah. But then he said it was like, oh, it's routine website maintenance. And I'm like, sure, honey, sure. But that was something that I think that he picked up on, is that and I'm going to use the term neoconservative, though that I think that that's generally now used as a slur, but I mean the general agreement of foreign policy hawkishness that was very popular in the Republican Party when this all got started, when I was a freshman in high school, and even before then. I think that there was a sense that Trump wisely recognized that that was incredibly unpopular with Americans. Even just hearing the early arguments, I think that you put it very well, of like our initial arguments for being in Afghanistan, that stopped being the argument for being in Afghanistan in 2002, 2003. Let's keep in mind that the Taliban, we could have had some sort of agreement made in December of 2001, in 2003, and in 2010, and after the surge. And in the first instance, Donald Rumsfeld turned it down. And I think that both Trump and Biden recognized, I think wisely, that this is an incredibly unpopular conflict, the arguments for which were never that great and have steadily disintegrated. And I think it's interesting how you're now seeing this being used as a partisan cudgel, because of course it is. But I think it's worth noting that both parties are responsible for a war that cost $2 trillion, for the $88 billion spent, quote unquote, training the Afghan army, that isn't getting paid. So where's that money? I said earlier that I could make a ludicrous reference here. And mine is basically like, you know that song where he's just asking questions like, what you got in that bag? What you got in that bag? Who's your weed man? How you smoke so good? Where is the $88 billion that was spent training the Afghan army that didn't get paid and understandably said, we would rather not do this? And I think that it's worth noting that this war has been a money sink and a money maker for a whole host of people. And what I just keep thinking about are the folks that I went to high school and college with who fought in this war. And there were people who were old enough to not only have fought in this war, but then to have children who were old enough to fight in this war.
Post 9/11 born troops.
Yeah. And I think that there are a lot of people who, and I've said this before, that like, this is bad. This is very bad, but it was never going to be good. And I think you've seen some kind of neoconservative arguments saying like, well, if we would have stayed for another year or another 5 years, and if we committed more troops and more specifically more American weaponry, and I'm like, but then what? Because essentially you've set up a client state. That's not, and then what are our goals? What are we supposed to be doing here? Even the debate about what the goals were and are and could be are just so amorphous that the whole thing just seems, it's very sad. I think that's my main thing I keep just thinking about, is that this is very, very sad.
So two things. Number one, I did tell you that you would be awarded extra points if you worked in a ludicrous reference in a discussion about Afghanistan. You did that. You do get those points. Number two, I think you made a really good argument about sort of the neoconservative critique that centers on the wisdom of the withdrawal itself. A lot of the other criticism that Biden is getting is about, okay, maybe it was the right idea to withdraw, but the execution of the withdrawal has been a bit of a disaster. Democratic Senator Chris Murphy, who's been supportive of Biden's policy, sort of hit back in that criticism. He tweeted, "I'm open to the possibility there was a different way to withdraw that wouldn't have led to a quick Taliban victory. But if that's your take, then come to the table with specifics on how your alternative would have created a different outcome." Tommy, do you see an alternative that would have worked better?
I mean, I think there's two issues to separate out. Like, there's the visa issues that you mentioned at the start, the SIV visa and the P2 visas and the broader war effort. Clearly, the Biden team didn't leave enough time to process these visas for interpreters or people who worked for USAID, or as we expand, like who might be eligible, people who work for news organizations. That process is slow and like just mind-bogglingly bureaucratic in a normal year. You add COVID on top of that, and it just slows to a crawl. And so I think that was a huge mistake. And Biden needs to fix that.
And when you say mistake, what they should have done is sort of just like streamlined all that paperwork.
Either streamline the paperwork or push out the withdrawal date. And I think when you say push out the withdrawal date, some people are saying, well, he should have just pushed out the withdrawal date past the fighting season, because in the summer the Taliban fights really hard. In the winter it's almost impossible, so they don't. I think what we're really talking about is like 2023, to allow time to sort out all the visa issues, get everybody out.
If you did that, can I just ask, if you did that and extended the withdrawal date, would the Taliban military offensive that ended in Kabul, would that still have happened? And then would U.S. troops been in danger and fighting Taliban forces while we waited longer to get that visa process in place?
Possibly. So basically, when we cut this peace deal with the Taliban, they stopped attacking U.S. forces. They were decimating Afghan forces. So it's an open question of whether they would have said, okay, Biden pushed the deadline from May to August, and they didn't, increase attacks on U.S. forces because they knew we'd get out of there eventually. It's an open question about whether they would have allowed for another extension. So I do think that's one thing you could have argued. But the other alternative is basically you have to say the U.S. should have a permanent troop presence where we're doing air support, intelligence, or logistics for the Afghans in perpetuity. And like Jane was saying, like this fantasy that there is some magical number of troops for 6 months or more that could have fixed it, it's a fiction. I mean, the coalition had 130,000 troops at the height of the surge in Afghanistan. We could not defeat the Afghans militarily. So it's very frustrating now to hear that, like, you could send 5,000 more guys, 10,000 more guys, and it would have been okay. The thing I do think you have to remember is I've heard a lot of, commentators on TV saying, man, both of the you could have had a few thousand guys there for a little longer and it would have been relatively safe or relatively low cost because there haven't been casualties lately. Again, there haven't been casualties lately because we cut a deal with the Taliban and they weren't attacking us. If they saw us as breaking that deal, I think they would have started attacking us again.
Yeah, exactly. Like that's the point here. And also, that argument of like, well, there haven't been any casualties lately. It's kind of like if you're a construction site, if you heard that there weren't any workplace injuries lately, that does not generate confidence here. But I think that the arguments that we have heard from the national security establishment and from U.S. security for the past 20 years have never been on the up and up about what's actually going on the ground in Afghanistan, especially with regard to the attempts to train the Afghan army. It was a money sink for the past 15 years. And I think that I just think that this idea of there being a better way, this is bad, but a better way that extends into 2023. Well, then what about 2025? What, like, we just start thinking about, again, like the permanency of this mission, which is something that I don't think very many people would have signed on to. And I think that that's the thing that's interesting, is that this is one of those moments, and I think about this a lot, that we sometimes see things as being like, the American people have spoken, or the American people think X. And generally you can ignore that. And people but this is one of those moments in which the American people are like 70% of Americans want out of Afghanistan. And there are a host of people who are like, no. What they mean is they want roughly 3,000 to 6,000 soldiers there all the time. They don't.
Well, that brings up the point, and obviously it's like too early to predict the political fallout, both short-term and long-term of this, of course. But like, what is your sense of like how the American people might react to what is a very complicated situation, which involves troops coming home, a 20-year war ending, the Taliban on video chanting "Death to America," and I'm sure that will get worse, scenes of chaos and potentially violence in Afghanistan, and refugees being settled in America? Like, how do you think that all plays out?
I have no idea. No idea. Not at all. Especially because historically, and for better or for worse, probably worse, foreign policy matters don't exactly figure into how Americans, or how really most people in most countries vote, with rare exceptions. And I think that the arguments here are that it's funny because you're seeing simultaneously that kind of the Trumpian argument is that, well, we would have done the same thing, but better. And so I think that it'll be really, I don't know how people are going to react to this. I also am curious as to how much of this, I think this might be a moment, I'm not sure personally, how much of this is because of who I happen to be following, people who are very engaged in the foreign policy space, but a lot of people aren't. And I think that I had a conversation yesterday where they were like, the New York Times, where my employer, the top is all Afghanistan. Afghanistan. And then if you go to like the most read articles, it's Maureen Dowd writing about Barack Obama's birthday party, which is like a great subject for an opinion piece. But I think that it goes to like how we think about them, how we think about events is largely how we think about these events impacting us personally. But I do want to say that there are a group of people for whom this would be deeply impactful, and that's the folks who are veterans of the wars in Afghanistan. And I'm sure that many of them are your listeners. And I happen to know a host of folks who have fought in both Afghanistan and in Iraq. And I think that when you're going to get a variety of opinions from veterans. And I think that it's very challenging when you have the kind of like the veteran opinion, because I'm like, millions of people have served and that is thousands of different opinions. But I do think that this must be an incredibly challenging time for people who have served, whether you were serving back in 2001, 2002, or if the people who are being sent back now as we speak. And I just keep thinking about those folks, because this is something where our understanding of this conflict it bleeds so much into our understandings of political conflicts and everything happening being entirely domestic. But if you were on the ground there, I knew a colleague who was stationed there, but he worked for GAO, but he was stationed there and went to the bar with soldiers, and his entire understanding of this was like, it's a very strange compound because there's a lot of fast food, but most people leave to go get food elsewhere. And it was just this very small experience of such a big subject. And I just keep thinking about how this is a very complicated conversation. And I feel as if this is going to somehow uncomplicate itself into being one about Democrats versus Republicans. And I'm concerned that the folks who have been there, who have been stationed there, who have fought there, who have died there will get forgotten.
Yeah, speaking of very simplistic takes, you're seeing this is Bidenssaigon sort of all over the coverage. Tommy, we were talking about this the other day, and you brought up John Kerry's very famous line when he was a soldier protesting the Vietnam War at home, when he said, how can you ask a man to be the last man to die for a mistake? And I do wonder, it's a line with such powerful and challenging implications, sort of how the country thinks about a war like this ending after 20 years in failure.
Yeah. Jane's opening point that I have no idea how this is going to cut politically either, I think is the right one. I do think there's a question sort of what do people know about what's happening? Do they know that the ins and outs of the decision to send more troops, the visa questions, whatever, or do they just know that we lost a war and they don't like losing things? Because I do worry that, when people are trying to figure out how this will go, there's all this polling about how Americans want to bring the troops home and end our war there. But, if you see real acts of barbarism from the Taliban, or evidence that terrorist groups are reconstituting, or just the fact that sort of the media has decided that this is a stain on Biden's legacy and a humiliating defeat. That's the language you're hearing in almost every story, that this is a humiliation for the United States, as if it's somehow noble to continue a project that was doomed to failure 10 years ago, right?
Right. And I think that explains the extremely bifurcated response you saw from the Trump administration, which argued simultaneously that they should start this exit and also attempted to drop some of the largest non-nuclear weapons we have in Afghanistan. Right. And so I think that that's something that is not unique to Trump or to Republicans or to Americans. I think that having that confused response is not at all. I think what I've seen mostly is I want it out, but not like this.
Yeah.
And I think that the thing that I'm thinking about a lot now also is that you're starting to see a certain person whose name rhymes with Bevan Biller talking about how, this is just an effort to turn America into Angela Merkel's Germany, which I'm like, Berlin's pretty cool. But talking about refugee, the process of permitting more, and I would say many, many, many more Afghan refugees come to the United States. And I think that that's a process by which you are starting to hear folks who are plugged into these conversations with refugee resettlement being increasingly concerned about. And especially because that's one thing the Biden administration showed seemingly no real urgency to start getting folks out of the country, and especially making refugee resettlement more possible in the country. And I'm aware that in part that's because we have just come out of a presidency that was so marked by a marked hatred for refugees and for the conceit of refugee resettlement. And this idea that we have to placate those type of attitudes as if they are normal or something that is something that should be placated. I understand that, but I think that this is a moment where that needs to be a major priority.
I mean, I found it very notable that the sort of neoconservative hawkish critique here is, yes, we should have stayed there and look at the chaos and look at the destruction, and that's what their angle is going to be. But where Miller and Trump and some of the Trumpier parts of the Republican Party are going to go is the refugee resettlement. And if they can gin up a refugee crisis on top of a border crisis, then they got themselves an argument. And it's notable to me that they find that more effective than shouldn't we have stayed in Afghanistan a little bit more. So I don't know what the politics are going to be, but clearly they think that it's more politically advantageous to demagogue about refugees than anything else.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be sort of an unfortunate outcome of how chaotic these last few days are, which is it's going to create more focus on efforts to get refugees out of Afghanistan, to speed up the SIV visa process, which, by the way, Congress has had years. I mean, the program was created in 2008, the Special Immigrant Visa Program. We've had years to get people out of Afghanistan. Congress has shown no urgency to speed up the process. So have subsequent administrations that could have reduced bureaucracy, made it faster, et cetera. But that's where our focus should be. The Canadians already announced that they're going to take in 20,000 individuals from Afghanistan. We should be doing 10 times that. Full disclosure, I thought Biden getting all troops out of Afghanistan was a good idea. I supported that decision. In hindsight, I think Barack Obama sending 53,000 more troops to Afghanistan in 2009 was a mistake, because we surged all these troops and we got back to nearly the same status quo. And he did it at the time because it looked like major population centers and cities were going to be overrun. And so we wanted to fight back against the Taliban. But the problem was the U.S. military can clear territory, they can kill people, they can hold territory, but there was no way to transfer it to an Afghan government or Afghan military or Afghan police to hold it, to provide security, to provide services, to all the things you would expect out of a basic government. Our ambitions were just far too great for this massive nation-building project, and we completely lost sight of the original reason we went there, which was Al-Qaeda.
Yeah. Last question on this, Jane. I mean, I don't know if we will learn these lessons, but what lessons should we learn from this about sort of the limits of U.S. foreign policy?
Well, we never learn anything.
I needed that caveat there.
We never learn it. I mean, I just keep thinking about how Rocky III is dedicated to the brave fighters of the Mujahideen. I think that it is that specificity that was lacking. And it was a specificity that I think it's interesting because I've started to see a lot of conservatives who are suddenly very concerned about the status of women and girls under the Taliban, as everyone should be. But I would make two notes here. I was a freshman in high school in 2001, and I was opposed to entering Afghanistan because I was a liberal in a conservative city. And the response I got from everyone was the Laura Bushist, don't you care about women and girls? Don't you know what the Taliban does to women and girls? And I'm like, yes, I'm aware of what happens here. But that was not the reason we were in Afghanistan. The reason we were in Afghanistan was to prevent Al-Qaeda from having a base of operations and to hunt down people who were connected with September 11th. Now, notably, most of the people involved with September 11th were from Saudi Arabia, where women and girls also do not have a great time, but we send them weapons and we have fun times with them, even when they murder journalists. And so I think that the moment we lacked that specific argument, the moment it became about, nation building, we're going to build an economy and a political system, and we're going to basically turn this into what we said was going to be its own independent government, but what turned out to be apparently a client state. And I think that lacking of specificity is something that I will remember in the future. And it's very weird to see the same arguments that we heard in 2001, 2002 being used again, where it is about, don't you know what the Taliban does to women and girls, when we know that wasn't why we were there in the first place. It just became like a nice amuse-bouche to be like, yes, why don't we throw that in too? When it's very clear that with the number of governments that we have close and happy relationships with that also are terrible to women and girls and sexual minorities, that wasn't our priority. And I really wish that we wouldn't have lied and said it was.
I saw a reporter that I really like and trust tweet, does the Biden administration's departure from Afghanistan, is that at odds with his pro-democracy promotion platform? And that made me despondent, because I think the lesson of the last 20 years is we cannot force democracy on a country at gunpoint. We cannot solve a country's political problems with our military. And so we have this, look, we're 20 years after 9/11, right? And this era has been defined by a wild overreaction to a massive psychological wound that I'm not in any way sort of trying to act like it wasn't. It was horrible for all of us, but it led us to invade countries, trample civil liberties, dump money on security operations that is not clear, that have made us safer. And we just haven't, I don't know, that we fixed some of the policies, but we haven't right-sided the mentality.
Yeah. Right. And I think that that's something I know we're going to be having a lot of 9/11 related takes and thoughts. And I will always think about how fucking sad it was and horrible it was and how horrible it continues to be. I remember that day. I remember where I was. I remember every aspect about it. I remember there was a girl I told it happened, and then she laughed because she didn't believe me. And I've never forgotten who that was and how mad I still am about that, even though she's 34 now and I should probably move on. But it was one of those moments in which this horrible thing happened, and the means by which we had to deal with it was this. And I think about that moment of the most important thing you can do is go to the mall. And the ways that this war became about 9/11, but not about 9/11. And it does seem to be that the war on terror in general was attempting to be about something, but wound up being largely, in my view, for nothing. And it's interesting because there's been a lot of response from people who were supportive of the war on terror, saying when was the last major terrorist attack you remember? And I'm you mean domestic or international, or what? How are we thinking about this? Because this did not, in my view, make us safer. It made us, in many ways, appear far weaker. Because, and then in a lot of ways, I think it generated an anti-American attitude that I think we've seen time and time again when you interview folks who have been involved in attempted or completed terror plots. They are thinking of their actions as reprisals for what our government has done in these countries. And so I think that the thing I keep thinking about is that this all started for horrifying, sad, bad ways, and it continues to be horrifying and sad and bad.
Yeah. I keep thinking about what Obama used to say and then clearly learned the hard way, which is, wars are much easier to start than they are to end. And that's something that we're seeing play out right now. The United States is now leading the world once again when it comes to the spread of COVID-19. Not only cases, but hospitalizations and deaths are spiking all over a country where 90% of all counties are now experiencing substantial or high transmission. Because about 30% of all eligible Americans have not yet chosen to get their first shot, a growing number of governments, businesses, and schools are trying to contain the pandemic by requiring vaccinations and or masks in indoor public settings. One big obstacle: Republican politicians, pundits, and activists. In Texas, Governor Greg Abbott banned mask mandates and vaccine mandates. In Florida, Governor Ron DeSantis banned mask mandates and threatened to withhold the salaries of school officials who defy him. Those two states alone, Florida and Texas, account for nearly 40% of the country's new hospitalizations. But Republicans are intent on waging a full-on culture war against public health measures just the same. Here's what some of them have been saying recently.
Everyone needs to get back down to common sense and remember that, we're human. We can't live forever. We are going to catch all kinds of diseases and illnesses and other viruses, and we get hurt sometimes.
You've had all the experts say, well, look out for the Delta variant or the Lambda variant. Next is going to be like the Chi Omega variant or the Pi Kappa Psi variant. I got the Florida variant. I got the Freedom variant. It affects the brain. It gets you to think for yourself, where you don't just surrender to the truth that they're trying to create and corrupt big media.
It makes you think, once you think about it, that maybe none of this is really about COVID. Maybe it's about social control.
So that last clip was from a school board meeting in Tennessee where some activists were threatening doctors. So that's cool. You also heard Marjorie Taylor Greene in there saying, hey, we can't live forever. Matt Gaetz talking about how the Florida variant has affected his brain. No argument there. Jane, do you think that Republican opposition to mask and vaccine requirements is rooted in a genuine belief about the need for limited government, or is there something else going on?
That's a very leading question, because of course there's something else going on here, especially when you see in Texas, they have like Austin bars where like, could we have a mask mandate? Could we require vaccines? And they're like, no, we'll shut you down if you do that, because that's how limited government works. No, but I think this is also an example of a moment in which you are seeing that, and I would argue this is also true in some cases for Democrats, of people being absolutely terrified of the base they need to vote for them. Where you're seeing Ron DeSantis arguing that they shouldn't even require proof of vaccination from people coming to the United States. And that's weird for Ron DeSantis. And he won't even endorse vaccine passports for, I mean, the argument of like, how desperate do you need to be to pander, where you're saying like no one should need proof of vaccinations. But I also think it's worth noting here that this is another one of those moments in which like we are hearing a lot about something, but I remain questioning as to whether or not it is reflective of like mass opinion. And I think that we see that with regard to masks. When you ask people about mask mandates in schools and elsewhere, they're generally supportive. But of course, there are people who are not supportive of that, and they're very, very, very loud. And I think that, and then you're seeing that also in smaller towns and elsewhere. They're attempting to defy these executive orders in Texas and Florida. But I also think like one of the things that always gets me is that this has become one of the challenges, and because we're thinking about we're doing an episode on this very subject, one of the things that's particularly challenging about COVID, if this were a disease that only appeared to impact a particular subgroup, none of this would be a problem, because no one has any problem ensuring that other people can't do something. And we see the very same people who argued, I went back a while back and was thinking, looking at how people treated folks with HIV in the late 1980s and early 1990s, because some moron on the internet tweeted something like, we wouldn't even do this to people with AIDS. And I'm like, oh, yes, we did. And we have. Because you see mass polling arguing that not people with full blown AIDS, but people with HIV should be legally prevented from marrying or having children, and that sterilization should be an issue. So let's keep in mind that when it comes to public health, how people think about this is often tied with how vulnerable they view themselves as being to either the disease itself or to the requirements of government. And so I think that this is one of those moments, especially when you're hearing people who are making the argument of like, oh, well, we all have to die from something. About what other disease would you make that argument? Like at a certain point, like, should we just stop funding cancer research? Like, because when you gotta go, you gotta go. But yeah, it's a challenging issue also, because something that I do want to bring up is that a lot of the people who are the loudest people who are saying that they absolutely would never get vaccinated under any condition tend to be working class white voters. That's pretty clear based on the research. But the number of people in a lot of urban areas who are unvaccinated or resistant to the vaccine, shall we say, are Black and brown Americans who are resistant for any number of reasons. And also folks within specific religious communities that are hesitant regarding the vaccine. So we have a lot of different forms of vaccine hesitancy. And my concern here is I want people to get vaccinated. I think that would be awesome. I would really prefer that everybody get vaccinated. Please get vaccinated. But I think that there are lots of different forms of vaccine hesitancy. And I think that occasionally we get very focused on like very loud Georgia CrossFit enthusiast vaccine like anti-vaccine enthusiasm. And we're not focused enough on the people who think, for instance, that you have to pay for the vaccine. Or something that I've been thinking about is when we got vaccinated in the beginning of the year, a lot of people tweeted about like, oh, I got really sick for about 2 days. if you're an essential worker or working in a job where you don't have vacation time, how appealing is it? Like, yeah, you're going to get this vaccine and then you're going to not be able to work for 2 days and you might lose your job. So have fun. It's still important for you to do it. Like, I think that we need to do more thinking about how the vaccine hesitancy, not vaccine refusal, because I think those are two separate issues, but we need to deal with each of those in a different way. And a lot of it is like, yes, there are going to be the Republicans or who are terrified of their base and terrified of saying anything that is supportive of the vaccine in any way, because apparently the worst thing in the world would be to not be in office. This remains like a funny thing about politics, is that like the worst thing in the world is not being a senator anymore. Like your life will go on if you are not in the United States
Not for
Senate.
these people.
You'd be a
Not for
lobbyist.
these people.
It'll be great.
Yeah.
Like, I live in Washington. You're allowed to still be here if you're not a United States senator. Like, you know, you can go to the bar. It'll be great. But I do think that we need to think, if we're thinking about increasing vaccination numbers and not just being incredibly angry, like, which you can also do. You can do both at the same time. But I think it's worth thinking about like vaccine hesitancy and the reasons behind it and how some of our own actions may contribute unintentionally to vaccine hesitancy and how to think about that.
Yeah, it's such a good point about vaccine hesitancy. I mean, you know, I was like, as soon as a vaccine was offered to me and I could get it, I was like first in line. I was really excited about it. So I'm someone who really, really loves vaccines. I, of course, got J&J, and so I've been thinking at some point about, oh, do I need a booster? But it's even like the thought process of that. You're thinking, okay, when would I get another shot? And how many days could I take off if I have side effects and not look at my busy schedule? And, you know, I have the luxury of taking days off, but you're right. There's a ton of people who, just for the sake of the fact that they can't take work off, or they don't have easy access to the vaccine, or someone hasn't knocked on their door and told them about it, that they may not take it. So it's not all these, as you said, the Georgia CrossFit crew. Mm-hmm. But I do think the reason we talk about that so much more, Tommy, is because Republican politicians have now made this an identity issue, which is what they've made so many other issues now, so that it's not based in sort of self-interest or what's good for you or what's going to make you feel better, what's going to save your life even. It's all about your identity as a partisan, and that sort of drowns out all the other sensible conversations. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, no, I know people in my life and friends of friends who, you know, were nowhere close to being Republicans, but they were scared by internet research, or, you know, maybe they came across Robert F. Kennedy on Facebook and they think like, oh, he's a Kennedy. This is a legitimate voice on policy.
No.
You know?
No. We're almost out of Kennedys you should listen to on Facebook. There's like we're low on Kennedy. Like if there's a Kennedy involved, like you got to, and it like then you're like RFK. Oh no, not that one.
Yeah, no, but like you could see how your average person would see him and think, oh, this is like a real serious thought leader. But you're right. I mean, on the Republican side, I just come to believe that culture fights are everything for Republican leaders, especially ones who want to win a Republican primary, right? I mean, you saw Josh Hawley with his budget resolutions, which are like ban critical race theory type on masks given to vaccinated, you know, abortion, like whatever crazy thing. You have Larry Elder, who's trying to run to recall Gavin Newsom in California, who did an interview one day where he said Gavin Newsom was elected fairly. A couple days later, he said he wanted a mulligan on that answer and had to clean it up and say that Biden was not actually elected fairly. So, like, you know,
because these people are terrified of the people they purportedly want to vote for them.
They're owned by their base now.
Right. And I think that that's something, it's interesting because I think with regard, you see occasionally conservatives arguing that Democrats are also controlled by their base, but that would mean that like the Democratic base is so myriad that you have like progressive base that actually hates Democrats and then like centrist base that hates progressives. And it's just like, it's like a very large, confusing high school that I am afraid of. But yeah, I think that they're also, the thing about it is that it is like an identity marker, and it's an identity marker that seems so constituent on this one thing, when you know that what gets me is that when you know all of the people making these talking points are vaccinated, like all of them are.
Yeah, the sin of hypocrisy is no longer a problem for anyone. That has just gone out the window.
Apparently not.
You know?
Right. They're all vaccinated, and especially because then you start getting into like when you're public health concerns, the relationship between public health and individual actions is always curious and questionable. And I've been in like a history wormhole, as I tend to be in. But if you go back to like the actual story of Typhoid Mary, one of the things that was about that was that like she was condemned by the city, but no one explained to her why she was in so much trouble. And she was just like, I just want to work. Why won't people let me do my job? And well, it turns out her job involved introducing people to typhoid fever, which is very unpleasant. But I think that intersection has always been really complicated for people. But it is interesting that this has been another moment in which the Kennedy I don't like and the people who were anti-vaxxers before this, the people who were like, no, you shouldn't get any vaccines for anything. Like, we are seeing a re-up of measles, which can kill you. We are seeing re-ups of numerous diseases that we were very proud of having eliminated. And it's interesting how that history has been helpfully forgotten by certain Republicans. I saw someone tweeted something like, maybe COVID will just be with us, like smallpox. And I'm like, who do you know who's gotten smallpox? We did that. Like, we eliminated it. There are vials of smallpox in very secure facilities in like 3 places on Earth. What are you even talking about? Like, there's a history here, and it's a complicated one. But I think that people are far too willing to ignore the complicated and embrace the easy.
Well, that is very true. And I mean, I do think what's depressing about it is, like, if seeing other people getting sick and dying around you, and in some cases getting sick and almost dying yourself, if that's not going to convince you to either get a life-saving shot or wear a mask inside for a little while longer, like, aren't you just beyond convincing at this point? Like, aren't you sort of beyond? Don't we have a group of people now, and some of these Republican partisans who are just like beyond the goal of politics itself, which is to like persuade people to see something differently? Like, if we can't do it on this issue, I don't know what's going to happen with anything else.
Well, when the aliens come, we are fucked. Is my big takeaway, and I guess climate change will be second to that. I mean, I do think fighting about this in a political context is probably just not the path forward. I do think like the fact that it's become a culture war issue bleeds into making it harder to convince these sort of fringe cases. Like, for example, Joe Rogan, right? Joe Rogan is like, I'm just an idiot comedian with like a massive audience. Why would anyone listen to me on vaccines or anything else? But he brings it up a lot. And then, fairly recently, a year or two ago, he had Alex Jones on, who was spreading anti-vaccine information about the polio vaccine, which I could have given you one Google search, one link to explain sort of the challenges with polio vaccinations, which is basically there's an oral version where you poop it out and you can infect people, but there's a version that gets injected into you that is completely safe and has basically eradicated the disease. That's the gist. But he has Alex Jones on, and they're like spreading sort of anti-vaccine conspiracy theories, and now he's sort of, in the place where Rogan just doesn't want to be told what to do by the libs or anybody else, so he's going to keep asking questions, right? And like that's how I think this whole debate has gotten distorted and stupid, and it's so fucking dangerous because it's not just the hardcore MAGAs.
Also because Alex Jones, as he has admitted in court, this is a performance art that is mostly meant to sell supplements. But I would also say that like that entire conceit, there's this internet terminology of just asking questions where you're just jacking off, where it is like all you're doing is asking questions, but like what is for questions for the pursuit of what? You have a thesis and you're just going to find support for your thesis. It's not a hypothesis. It's not the if-then statement and then you might be wrong and you're like, well, turns out I was wrong. No, they're like you have a thesis and you're just going to find the pieces of information that support it. And I think that is one of those things where the conceit of the internet was like you could have all of the information in the world, but you wouldn't stop being a person. Like there were people, the person who basically invented the idea of like washing your hands for surgery wound up in a mental hospital because he was basically telling surgeons at the time, your hands are dirty. And they were like, but I'm a gentleman. I'm always clean. And they're like, no, you aren't. And they're like, no, you're wrong. And it basically drove him insane. And then he ironically died of an infection due to a wound he received from a prison guard in a mental assignment. So like
history is the worst.
Yeah, man. People are like, the problem here is people. The problem here is that like the intricacies of people in groups, it's always going to be really hard to deal with, especially when you need them to do something. And I always like, I understand wanting to have this be an apolitical space, this conversation around COVID, but I'm really trying to think of an illness that we've faced that hasn't been political throughout history, and I just cannot think of one.
Well,
like, do you remember when we were like, the idea, especially because at first COVID wasn't going to be a thing, and then COVID was a thing, but it wasn't that bad. But it's interesting because the same people arguing that it's not that bad are suddenly very allegedly worried about undocumented migrants bringing in COVID, which I'm like, but why would you be worried? Because remember, it's not that bad. Like, that none of this makes sense. None of it makes sense, but none of it ever would.
Well, that's because it's never going to be apolitical once the government is involved, and the government is involved because this is a public health issue, right? And I do think, back to my original question to you, which is like, is there some sincere belief in limited government driving this? It's not a sincere belief in limited government, but it is a skepticism and cynicism about government and institutions. And to your point, Jane, the whole just asking questions is designed to make people distrust people in positions of authority, whether it's the government, whether it's their own doctor, whether it's their own community public health official. And I do think that's been driving so many of these Republican culture wars anyway, is that like people in positions of authority, people in positions of power, you can't trust, and they're trying to screw you. And that is sort of what drives this whole message for them.
I would also say, for better or for worse, we also give the government no flexibility to be wrong, right?
Correct.
The novel coronavirus, it was a brand new thing. For a while, we thought it was on surfaces. We thought masks might be a bad idea. They corrected that when they could. But, that creates a big, trust gap with the U.S. government that I don't know has been filled. Now, do I think people should be able to, like, intellectually get over that? Sure. But I also can understand how, if you're a parent, you're trying to figure out, like, is this new mRNA vaccine safe? Should I give it to my kid eventually? Like, it's a scary, big decision. I do think we have to approach that with some empathy and some understanding to try to get them the information they need. And it's probably going to be outside of the political context, which, is why I sort of have long thought it's best when you have other people communicating about these things. But look, today we're just asking questions, which is, like, is Lovett out today because he was arrested and charged?
Just asking questions.
I could find the answer easily by Googling, like Joe Rogan could, but instead I'm just going to ask questions because that's easier for me.
That is an easier thing to do. But
and
no,
it's more fun.
I do think that's why, Tommy, like, I try to approach with some, there are all these pieces lately and headlines and tweets that sort of like sneer or celebrate when an unvaccinated person is in the hospital and dying. And even when like Charlie Warzel tweeted a good piece about it the other day, and I retweeted that, and I saw that he starts getting ratioed by a whole bunch of people who were like, I've lost my patience with unvaccinated people, fuck them, they should. And it's like, look, I'm enraged at most unvaccinated people for not doing this. I'm more enraged at the people who are spreading the disinformation, and I'm trying to have some humility and understanding for especially a lot of the people that Jane was talking about who aren't like these crazy Republican partisans who are just trying to do this to stir up trouble, but just people who are scared and confused and have been spread a lot of misinformation.
Yeah, look, I have people I love deeply and who are not vaccinated, who I worry about all the time. And, there's what can you do?
Yeah,
they're not doing this to hurt somebody else. They just have come to a different conclusion based on the fucking cesspool of garbage that's available on Facebook and the internet about wildly complicated issues. And they're probably sold a bill of good by charlatans who use it to make a profit, et cetera, et cetera. But here we are. Like, look, I'm no science expert, right? I'm just regurgitating what I read as well. But, I have faith in these institutions.
That's something that I think that we don't talk enough about. Like, I also was like, there's a vaccine, I'll go get it, fine.
Right.
And I think that there's an element to which we have this conceit of expertise. And I was just talking about, like, we were talking about Afghanistan earlier, and you have the conceit of expertise of the people who were like, the Afghan army is going to be fine. And I'm like, I am not in Kabul. And I was like, I'm like, I don't know enough about this, but then people who do know a lot about this seem to be thinking this one thing. And so I could kind of understand how people would be like, at a certain point, whose expertise is there and whose expertise isn't there.
Right.
But at the same time, you see the same people who, you see the same people who are very resistant to the medical establishment telling them what to do with regard to COVID, who then, if they get COVID, will be inherently reliant on that same medical institution. The people who are on oxygen, the folks who are dying in hospitals. where like it's so I mean, human nature is incredibly complicated and complex, and how we think about these things. But I do see that there is an element here where you're like, how do we trust these people but not these people? What is research and what is quote unquote research? Like, when am I just listening to people who sound like me, so it sounds correct? And when am I actually getting real information? When am I, because I think that one thing is, for instance, people look at the trying to find like, well, all these people have been injured by the vaccine, and they're using a website to which the CDC invites you to upload these instances of challenges with vaccines. The problem is that when you go back and look at them, some of the people haven't even received the vaccine at all.
Right.
But then you're like, but it's, it's a website and it looks scientific.
Right.
And I'm like, yeah. And I look at websites that look scientific, and I have sources that I believe and sources that I don't believe. And I think that it's really hard in these moments, especially when the people who are supposed to be informing us about a lot of different subjects, we've seen them again and again be wrong. But I think that where I always go is like, when you're wrong, admit it and explain how you were wrong and how you got to your wrong conclusion. And if you have a lot of different pieces of information and they all are, they come from differing places and people who might differ ideologically, but they center on the same basic finding, I'm like, okay, that seems believable. But I do understand how this is a time where it seems as if everything is believable, but nothing is. And that's really hard in the midst of a pandemic.
No one can predict the future. I have empathy for people who are scared or confused. I have scorn and disgust and hatred for the people like Donald Trump Jr. who spread anti-vaccine information or just fearmonger because they think it'll help them politically. Those are the people I think should be written off from society.
100%. And just to end on a somewhat positive note,
all right,
whether it's been because so many cases have been going up in hospitalizations and deaths, or people becoming more persuaded, we have seen sort of the vaccinations increase over the past month. I think we're now at like the highest level every day we've been at since July 4th. So at least it is heading slowly in the right direction. Jane Coaston, thank you so much. It's fantastic to have you, Jane. We should come back again soon. Let's do it again.
Let's do it, and then maybe something will be happening. I don't know. Maybe we'll get to talk about like something. I'm just not even like happy, just like neutral.
Well, okay. We'll shoot for having you back for a neutral conversation.
What's a good thing we could talk about?
I don't know. We'll have to. I mean, we'll see.
I haven't finished White Lotus yet. Is that good?
It is.
Okay.
Flavia and I were just talking about it before the episode began. It's the finale is quite good.
I have not seen it. And I just keep inventing what it's about based purely on images that people use in memes.
I like that.
Like, it's like how Big Little Lies, I just assume, is about lesbians. I don't know what it's about, but I'm assuming it is. And I'm like, oh, busy lesbians, my favorite kind. Like, especially, I'm in this weird moment in content where I can only watch things that will make me feel neutral, positive, or good.
Oh.
So I'm like, people keep recommending, like, I don't understand why the Trump administration seemed to correspond with people telling me to watch, like, don't you want to watch The Handmaid's Tale? No. I want to watch Midsummer Murders. I want to watch, like, old episodes of Poirot. I want to see if I can find old episodes of Wishbone. Like,
this is why I watched Emily in Paris, and all these people came down on me like a ton of bricks. And you know what?
Here we go.
It was mindless. It was fun. Then I watched the 1999 Woodstock doc, and it's fucking depressing.
Yeah.
No. I'm just like, I want to, like, listen to nonsense and then watch nonsense. And then, like, Hulu's like, do you want to watch some more nonsense? I'm like, yeah,
of course I do.
Really. I'm just going to watch Brooklyn Nine-Nine, but not like the new season where they're actually dealing with the stuff that happened last summer. I watch old episodes. You know what never fails? Golden Girls, but not the episodes where Dorothy has to deal with having chronic fatigue syndrome, because that's too hard. I just want to hear St. Olaf stories.
No, this is like the success of Ted Lasso, right? People are like, the fact that it's groundbreaking. It's groundbreaking that there's a show about a nice guy. Everyone's like, what is this all about? A nice guy
who then inspires other people to be nice. I was like, I can't get into it. Everybody's into it. And then we started watching it like last weekend, and we just barreled through because I was like, I don't feel anything but good.
Yeah, I felt that way with Hacks too, even though it was kind of sad.
Oh yeah, Hacks is good about that.
I like this pop culture close. This is the most fun.
This is good. And also, I want to thank Jane, because even though this is an episode about Afghanistan and redistricting and COVID, we are going to name it Busy Lesbians now, which is
Yeah.
Right.
after
Amazing.
Big Little Lies.
Perfect. A show, again, people are going to email me.
I never saw it
and
either.
are
Never saw Big Little Lies
Yeah.
myself.
People are going to email me and be like, Big Little Lies is actually not about that. And I'm like, I'm just going to ask questions. And I'm just going to do my own research by making it up.
Perfect.
Where was Lovett arrested? It's another
don't know.
question. We don't know.
Thank you, Jane. We appreciate it. And
Thank you, Jane.
we'll talk to you later.
Absolutely.
Bye.
All right. Bye.
Two big announcements. Journalist Josie Duffy Rice has joined What a Day as co-host alongside Gideon Resnick and recently announced co-hosts Travell Anderson and Priyanka Arabindi. Josie's first episode drops today.
I'm just applauding that.
It's good to applaud.
Thank you.
Also, second announcement, Crooked is back with a brand new season of This Land, where award-winning journalist Rebecca Nagel takes you inside her year-long investigation into how conservatives are using a series of custody battles over Native American children to dismantle American Indian tribes. This Land's trailer is out right now, and the first 2 episodes premiere on August 23rd. Subscribe to What a Day and This Land wherever you get your podcasts.